I took a 4-month job thousands of miles from home because my family desperately needed the money. But when I returned 2 weeks early without telling anyone, the house was freezing and my wife sat trembling in her wheelchair, so thin I barely recognized her. "Where's our son?" I whispered. She lowered her eyes. "On a luxury cruise, with his whole family." Then I checked our bank account and froze. I didn't call him. I changed the locks, made one phone call, and waited. Far out at sea, their dream vacation was about to become a nightmare. I need to know who's in this with me right now. Drop your city or country in the comments. It means the world to see where Dad's revenge stories reaches. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, share this. They may need to hear it. Some details in this story have been shaped for storytelling purposes. Names and locations are fictional, but the lesson at the heart of it is one I hope you carry with you. The drive from Denver International had taken just under 2 hours, and I spent most of it with the windows cracked, despite the cold, letting the Colorado night air hit my face hard enough to keep me awake. 4 months on the North Slope will do something to a man. It rewires the way you breathe, the way you sleep, the way you measure time. Up there, the sun barely moved in winter, and the wind had a particular cruelty to it, not just cold, but personal, like it had decided to make an example out of you specifically. But none of that mattered tonight. Tonight I was going home. I had a wool scarf for Margaret, the kind she had pointed to in a catalog back in January and never ordered for herself because she said it was too expensive. I had an Alaska hoodie for Sophie, size medium, because she was 16 and growing fast. I had a small bottle of bourbon for Kevin tucked in the side pocket of my duffel. And I had a strawberry cheesecake from a bakery I had spotted near the rental car counter at DIA, still in the white box on the passenger seat beside me. I had not told anyone I was coming back 2 weeks early. I wanted to see Margaret's face when I walked through the door. That was all. After 4 months of FaceTime calls with bad signal and 12-hour shifts that left my hands smelling like machine grease no matter how hard I scrubbed, I wanted one moment that was just mine. Just ours. I pulled onto our street in Fort Collins at 9:15. The neighborhood was quiet, the way suburbs get quiet on weeknights. Porch lights on living room windows glowing blue from televisions. Somebody's sprinkler system running even though it was barely warm enough for it. Normal. Ordinary. The kind of ordinary I had been dreaming about since February. I almost missed it at first. Our house was dark, not one light on anywhere. Not the kitchen. Not the upstairs hallway light Margaret always left on after dark, because she said a dark staircase was a broken ankle waiting to happen. Not even the small lamp in the front window that we had kept on a timer for 20 years. Just dark. I sat in the driveway for a moment, hands still on the wheel, engine ticking as it cooled. Kevin's car was not there. I figured he had gone home for the night. He only lived 20 minutes away, and Margaret always told him not to stay too late. That part made sense, but the lights made no sense at all. I grabbed my duffel and the cheesecake and walked to the front door. The cold snap of the Colorado evening hit me through my jacket, and I noticed the smell the moment I stepped onto the porch. Something stale, old. The kind of smell that settles into a house when the windows have been shut for too long and nobody has been cooking real food. My key turned in the lock. Margaret. Nothing. The hallway was dark, except for the faint glow of a streetlight coming through the side window. I reached for the wall switch and flipped it. The overhead light buzzed on, and what I saw made my chest seize up like someone had reached in and grabbed a fistful of whatever was in there. Dishes stacked in the kitchen sink, some of them crusted with food that had dried days ago. A trash bag next to the back door, so full it had tipped sideways against the cabinet. A thin film of dust on the hallway console table where Margaret usually kept a vase of flowers. The vase was there, but the flowers were long, dead brown and brittle petals scattered across the wood. Margaret. I called louder this time, and my voice bounced off the walls in a way that sounded wrong, too sharp, too empty. Then I heard it, a sound from upstairs. Small, weak. Walter. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my duffel banging against the railing, the cheesecake box crushed against my chest. The upstairs hallway was even darker than the ground floor, and I had to push through the half-open bedroom door by feel before I found the light switch inside. What I saw when the light came on stopped me cold in the doorway. Margaret was sitting in her wheelchair next to the bed. She was wearing my old Tennessee sweatshirt, the gray one I had left hanging on the back of the closet door, and it hung off her shoulders like she was a child who had put on her father's clothes. Her face, which I had memorized over 36 years of marriage, looked like someone had taken it and hollowed it out. Her cheekbones pressed sharp against her skin. Her collarbones made shadows above the neckline. Her hands were folded in her lap, and when she looked up at me, they began to tremble. Walter. Her voice cracked on the single syllable of my name, and then her face crumpled and she pressed one shaking hand over her mouth and began to cry, not quietly. Not the gentle kind of tears I had seen from her a handful of times over our marriage, but the deep, broken, inconsolable kind that comes from somewhere a person has been holding, sealed for a very long time. I crossed the room in 3 steps and dropped to my knees in front of her wheelchair. I took both her hands in mine. They were ice cold. "Hey!" My own voice came out rougher than I intended, scraped raw. "Hey, I'm here. I'm right here." "You're early," she managed between uneven breaths. You didn't say." "I wanted to surprise you." I squeezed her hands, trying to push warmth into them. "Margaret, how long have your hands been this cold? When did you last eat something?" She turned her head toward the small table beside the bed. There was a package of crackers on it, the sleeve half open. A plastic cup with about an inch of water left in it. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. "That's not an answer," I said, and I kept my voice level because I needed her to stay calm, even though everything inside me was screaming. "When did you last have a real meal?" Helen brought something over. She wiped her face with the back of one trembling hand. 2 days ago, I think. Or maybe 3. I stood up and walked to the kitchen. I told myself to move slowly, to think clearly, to not let my hands shake the way they wanted to. I opened the refrigerator. 4 eggs. A half-gallon of milk with an expiration date that had passed 6 days ago. 2 cans of soup on the shelf above the produce drawer. A jar of mustard. A bag of baby carrots that had gone soft and pale. That was everything. I stood there with the refrigerator door open and the cold air spilling out onto my boots, and I breathed very carefully through my nose for about 10 seconds. Then I closed the door and walked back upstairs. "Where's Kevin?" I asked from the doorway. My voice came out steady. I was proud of that because the rest of me was anything but. Margaret looked down at her hands, still folded in her lap, still trembling at the knuckles. "Margaret." I stepped into the room. "Where is Kevin?" She lifted her head and met my eyes, and what I saw in her face was not the answer to my question. It was the look of a woman who had been carrying something very heavy, completely alone for a very long time, and had just watched someone else finally walk through the door. "Caribbean," she said. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. "I'm sorry." My voice came out quieter than I intended. "Kevin is in the Caribbean, Walter." Her chin wobbled. He took Jessica and Sophie, and she stopped, pressed her lips together, then pushed through it. And Jessica's family, all of them. I pulled the desk chair from the corner of the room and sat down directly in front of her so we were eye level. How many people? I asked. 10. The word barely made a sound. I reached out and took her cold hands in mine again. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my back teeth, but I kept my face still and my grip steady because Margaret was shaking badly enough for both of us, and one of us needed to be the anchor right now. "Okay," I said quietly. "Okay. I'm going to go downstairs and make you something to eat. And then you're going to tell me everything." I made her eat first. I found a can of chicken soup in the pantry, heated it on the stove, and brought it upstairs with 2 slices of toast and a glass of water. Margaret held the bowl with both hands like she was afraid it might disappear, and the sight of that, my wife of 36 years, holding a bowl of canned soup like it was something precious, made my jaw tighten so hard I thought I might crack a molar. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched her eat. I did not rush her. I did not pepper her with questions. I just watched the color try to come back into her face, spoonful by spoonful, and I kept my breathing even and my hands flat on my knees. When the bowl was empty, she looked up at me. "You want to know everything," she said. It was not a question. "I want to know everything," I confirmed. She set the bowl on the nightstand. Her hands were still trembling, but less than before. The food was helping, and that small mercy made something loosen very slightly in my chest. "Kevin said you were under too much pressure," she began. "He said if I kept calling you about every little thing you might lose focus on the job, that the contract might fall through." I felt the first cold thread of something that was not quite anger, but was close enough to shake hands with it. "He said that." My voice came out flat. "He said it more than once." Margaret pulled the sleeves of my sweatshirt down over her hands, a gesture I recognized from 36 winters together. She did it when she was nervous. "I tried to call you. There were nights I picked up the phone and started dialing, and then I thought Walter is up there working himself to the bone for us. What am I going to say? That I'm lonely, that the house is cold? You could have said exactly that." My throat felt like I had swallowed gravel. "Margaret, that is exactly what you should have said." She pressed her lips together and nodded, and I could see she was fighting back another wave of tears. I reached over and squeezed her knee through the sweatshirt fabric. "Who else is on the trip?" I asked, pulling us back to solid ground, to facts I could actually work with. Jessica's mother, Carol." She counted on her fingers, those still trembling fingers. "Melissa, that's Jessica's sister, and her husband, Greg. Their 2 kids. Brian, Jessica's brother, and his girlfriend. 10 people total, Walter. 10. I did the math without meaning to. 10 people. Caribbean cruise. I thought about what that cost and felt something shift dangerously behind my sternum. "How long have they been gone?" I asked. 11 days. They come back in 3. I nodded, slowly stood up, and told her I would be right back. I went downstairs, sat at the kitchen table, and called Tasha Reed. She picked up on the second ring. "Mr. Hayes." Her voice was careful in the way that told me she already knew why I was calling. "Tasha." I kept my voice level. "Why aren't you coming to take care of Margaret?" A pause, not long, but long enough. "Kevin called the agency 9 weeks ago, Mr. Hayes. He said the family had decided to handle Margaret's care themselves. He officially terminated the contract." Another pause. "I assumed you knew." "I'm so sorry. I should have called you directly. I thought about it, but Kevin said..." What did Kevin say? He said you were managing things remotely and didn't want to be bothered with administrative details. Her voice dropped. Mr. Hayes, I want you to know that I asked him twice to confirm. I felt uncomfortable about it. But he had your authorization form on file, and he said you'd both discussed it. I had never discussed anything of the sort. Can you come back? I asked. Starting tomorrow morning. Yes, she said immediately, and the relief in that single word told me she had been worried about Margaret this whole time and had not known what to do about it. Yes, absolutely. 7 a.m. 7 a.m., I said. Thank you, Tasha. I hung up and immediately dialed Nina Alvarez, the physical therapist, who came 3 times a week to work with Margaret on her mobility exercises. Nina had been a godsend in the early weeks after Margaret came home from the hospital patient, skilled, genuinely invested in Margaret's progress. Nina answered on the 4th ring, slightly out of breath. Mr. Hayes, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I just got back from Alaska, I said. I'm trying to understand what happened with Margaret's therapy sessions. The pause on Nina's end was longer than Tasha's had been. When she spoke, her voice was careful and measured. Kevin called me approximately 8 weeks ago. He said that you and Margaret were facing some unexpected financial difficulties related to the medical bills and that you needed to pause the therapy sessions temporarily. She hesitated. He said you had spoken with the insurance company and were working on a new payment arrangement and that you would contact me when you were ready to resume. I sent 2 follow-up emails to the address on file. I never received them, I said. I see. Another hesitation. Mr. Hayes, I have to be honest with you. I was concerned. Margaret had been making real progress. Stopping abruptly at that stage of recovery it's not ideal. I should have pushed harder. Can you restart her schedule? I'll move things around, Nina said firmly. I can be there day after tomorrow. We'll do an assessment first and go from there. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long moment, both hands pressed flat on the surface, staring at the wood grain. Kevin had told Tasha I didn't want to be bothered. He had told Nina we were having financial difficulties. He had told Margaret that calling me might cost me my contract. 3 different lies. 3 different people. All pointing in the same direction. I went back upstairs. Margaret was still in her wheelchair, but she had turned it slightly toward the window. The streetlight outside cast a pale stripe across the floor. Walter, she said without turning around. I fell. My hand tightened on the doorframe. When? 3 weeks ago. She turned to face me then, and the expression on her face cracked something open in the center of my chest. Not the tears this time, but the particular look of someone who has survived something alone and is only now finally allowed to admit it. I was trying to get to the kitchen. I thought if I went slowly enough along the wall I could manage. I almost did. Almost, I repeated. I went down near the stove. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I couldn't get up, Walter. I tried for I don't know how long. A long time. I called Kevin. My jaw was so tight it ached. What did he say? He said he was in a meeting. He said I'd be okay. He said to try rolling onto my side and pushing up from there. Her chin trembled violently, and she pressed her knuckle against her lips to steady it. I couldn't. I couldn't. So I called out. I called as loud as I could, and eventually Helen heard me through the kitchen window. I'd left it cracked for the air. I walked across the room and crouched in front of her wheelchair, both hands on her armrests, my face level with hers. Oh, how long were you on that floor? My voice came out barely above a whisper, because if I spoke any louder, I was not sure what would come out instead. Margaret's eyes filled completely. 2 tears ran straight down her face, one on each side, perfectly parallel, and she did not wipe them away. "Almost 2 hours," she said. I reached up and put both hands on either side of her face very gently, and she grabbed my wrists and held on so hard her knuckles went white. "I'm here," I told her. "I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." She bent forward and pressed her forehead against my shoulder, and cried the way she had not let herself cry in 9 weeks deep, shaking the kind of grief that has been waiting for a safe enough place to finally come apart. I wrapped both arms around her and held on, and I let her because that was the only useful thing I could do in that moment. But over her shoulder in the back of my mind, behind everything warm and present and necessary about holding my wife, while she finally broke down, a number was forming. $24,870. I did not know that yet, but I was about to find out. I did not sleep that night. I lay on top of the covers beside Margaret's side of the bed and stared at the ceiling, while she finally slept. Really slept, the deep, unconscious kind that comes after a person has been running on adrenaline and fear for so long that the body simply gives out the moment it feels safe enough. Her breathing evened out within 20 minutes of me turning off the lamp, and I lay there in the dark, listening to it, counting the seconds between each exhale, convincing myself with every breath that she was still okay. At some point before 5 in the morning, I went downstairs, made a pot of coffee strong enough to strip paint, and sat at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand. I scrolled through 4 months of text messages from Kevin. Short ones, cheerful ones. "Everything's great, Dad. Mom's doing well, Dad. Don't worry about a thing, Dad." I set the phone face down on the table. At 7:15, Tasha Reed pulled into our driveway in her white Civic, the same car she had driven for the 3 months she worked with us before I left for Alaska. She knocked twice before I opened the door, and when she saw my face, she did not say good morning. She just said, "How is she?" "Sleeping still," I said. "Come in." Tasha was 42, broad-shouldered with close-cropped hair and the kind of steady, unflappable energy that makes a good caregiver. She had worked with spinal injury patients for over 15 years. Margaret had liked her from the first week, which was not a small thing. Margaret was particular about people in her space. Tasha stepped inside and looked around the kitchen. Her eyes moved the way a professional's eyes move, cataloging, assessing, not reacting. But I saw the small tightening around her mouth when she looked at the pantry shelf and the near-empty refrigerator I had left open by accident. "I'll do a full assessment when she wakes up," Tasha said quietly. "And Mr. Hayes, I want to apologize again. I should have contacted you directly when Kevin called. Something felt off about it, but I didn't trust my instinct, and I'm sorry for that. You did what made sense at the time," I said because I meant it. Kevin had been convincing enough to fool 3 different people who had no reason to doubt him. "It's not on you." I was pouring Tasha a coffee when I heard a knock at the front door. Helen Brooks was standing on the porch in a fleece zip-up and gardening clogs, her silver hair still damp from a morning shower. She was 68 years old and had lived across the street from us for 14 years. She brought us soup when Margaret had her surgery. She had a key to our house for emergencies, a key I had given her myself before I left for Alaska, specifically because I trusted her. When she saw me, her hand flew to her chest. "Walter." Her voice broke on my name. "Oh, thank God. Thank God you're back." Her eyes were filling up before she even made it through the door, and I felt my own throat constrict in response because Helen Brooks was not a woman who cried easily. In 14 years, I had never seen it. "Come in," I said. "Tell me what you know." We sat at the kitchen table, the three of us, me, Helen, and Tasha, who had stayed because she understood instinctively that whatever Helen was about to say was going to matter. Margaret was still upstairs. I had checked on her twice already. Helen wrapped both hands around the coffee mug I set in front of her and took a long breath. 3 weeks ago, she began. It was a Tuesday evening around 6 o'clock. I was out front pulling weeds along the flower bed. I had the side window cracked because I'd been cooking and it was warm in the kitchen. She stopped, steadied herself. I heard Margaret call out. Just once, but loud. I knew right away it wasn't right. My hand tightened around my own mug until the ceramic bit into my palm. I came straight over, Helen continued. The front door was unlocked. Margaret always kept it unlocked during the day, in case she needed to call someone in. I found her on the kitchen floor next to the stove. She had been trying to reach the counter and the wheelchair slipped. Helen's voice dropped. She was on that floor for close to 2 hours, Walter. She told me she had called Kevin. He told her to try to get herself up and that he'd check on her later. The kitchen went very quiet except for the sound of the refrigerator humming. He didn't come, I said. It was not a question. He did not come. Helen confirmed, and the flatness in her voice held more judgment than any raised voice could have. I called 911 myself, but Margaret, she begged me not to. She said Kevin had told her not to make a fuss, that an ambulance would cost too much, and that she wasn't seriously hurt. Helen looked at me directly. She wasn't seriously hurt that time. But Walter, another fall like that. I know. My voice came out rough and low. Helen, I know. Thank you for going over there. Helen reached across the table and put her hand briefly over mine. Her eyes were wet, and she blinked hard to clear them. I've been checking on her every day since, bringing food when I could. But I'm not a nurse, and I'm 70 years old, and there were nights I didn't know if she was. She stopped, pressed her lips together. Started again. I should have called you. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place, that Kevin had it handled, and nobody had it handled. Tasha said very quietly, and there was no accusation in her voice, just the plain truth of it. I excused myself from the table. I walked upstairs, stepped into the bedroom, and stood for a moment looking at Margaret, who was still asleep. Her face finally softened into something close to peace. Then I opened the drawer of her nightstand. I don't know exactly why, some instinct, some need to touch the small, ordinary objects of her daily life and remind myself she was still here. There were 2 folded pieces of paper in the back of the drawer beneath her reading glasses and the paperback novel she had been working through since January. I took them out and unfolded them. The first was a printed notice from Tasha's agency, termination of services effective 9 weeks ago. Kevin's signature at the bottom, neat and confident. The second was a cancellation notice from Nina's practice. Same date 1 week later. Kevin's signature again. I stood very still with both papers in my hands. My chest was doing something complicated that I did not have a name for yet. Not quite grief, not quite rage, something that lived in the space between the two, and had its own particular weight. Margaret's voice came from behind me, rough with sleep. I found those in the mailbox, she said. About a month ago. Kevin usually got the mail before I could get to the door, but that day he was running late. She paused, and when I turned around, she was watching me with clear, tired eyes. I didn't know what they meant exactly, but something felt wrong about them, Walter. Something felt wrong, so I kept them. I looked at my wife, this woman who had been left alone in a cold house with an empty refrigerator and a broken phone, and nothing but 2 folded pieces of paper she had hidden in a nightstand drawer because her instincts told her to hold on to something, anything that might matter later. My eyes burned hot and sudden, and I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth for a moment, because I needed a second before I could speak. "You did exactly right," I managed. "These matter. These matter a great deal." Margaret reached out and took my free hand in both of hers, holding on the way she had the night before, tight, urgent, like she was afraid I might disappear again the moment she let go. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I folded both papers carefully and tucked them into the breast pocket of my shirt directly over my heart. "I'm going downstairs," I said, "and I'm going to open the bank account." The laptop was where I had left it 4 months ago, on the desk in the small room off the hallway that I had always called the office, even though it was barely big enough for a desk, a bookshelf, and the filing cabinet Margaret had picked out at a garage sale in 2011. I sat down, opened it, and waited for it to boot up. Helen had gone home. Tasha was upstairs with Margaret doing the assessment she had promised, speaking to her in that calm, unhurried voice that I had come to think of as one of the most reassuring sounds I had ever heard. I could hear the low murmur of it through the ceiling, steady and professional, and it helped me breathe. I opened the browser and navigated to our bank's website. I had been telling myself on the drive from Denver on the stairs in the kitchen, while I heated soup, I had been telling myself that I was prepared for something bad, that I had already built myself up for a difficult number. A few $1,000s, maybe. 5, perhaps. Kevin had always been careless with money, and I had always known that, and I had always told myself I had accounted for it. I logged in. The balance on the screen made me go completely still, not the kind of still where you hold your breath, the kind of still where your body simply stops processing anything that isn't the number directly in front of you. I leaned forward and read it again. Then I clicked on Transaction History. The charges went back 11 weeks, starting almost immediately after I had boarded my flight to Anchorage in February. At first they looked ordinary. Grocery stores, a pharmacy, the home health supply company where we ordered Margaret's medical equipment. I kept scrolling. Then the pattern shifted. Delta Airlines, 2 tickets to Miami, then 4 more, then 4 more after that. A hotel in Miami Beach, 2 nights, a rate that made my back teeth ache. Royal Caribbean Cruise Line, deposit. Then a second charge. Then a third labeled cabin upgrade, which was nearly $3,000 by itself. A spa reservation aboard the ship. A shore excursion company in Nassau. A clothing boutique in Miami, $1,140 in a single transaction. A restaurant on the waterfront, $620 for one dinner. I stopped scrolling. I sat back in the chair and pressed both hands flat against the desk and looked at the ceiling for a moment, because I needed somewhere neutral to put my eyes while my brain caught up with what my eyes had just read. $24,870. Gone. I said it out loud quietly to the empty room, because sometimes you have to hear a thing in your own voice before it becomes real. $24,870. Then I picked up my phone and opened Instagram, something I almost never did. I found Jessica's account in under 30 seconds because Sophie had shown it to me once at Christmas, laughing about some reel her mother had posted about a home renovation project that had gone sideways. The most recent post was from 4 days ago. 10 people standing on the upper deck of a cruise ship. The Caribbean sun was behind them, turning everything gold and perfect. Jessica was in the front, in a white sundress, one hand raised with a champagne flute, laughing at something off camera. Kevin was beside her with his arm around her shoulders, squinting into the light, grinning the easy grin of a man without a single thing to worry about. Sophie was in the back row, And even in the small photo, I could see that she was not quite smiling the way everyone else was. Her expression was off by just enough that someone who loved her would notice. I noticed. The caption read, "Family deserves memories." I set my phone face down on the desk. For a long moment, I did not move. There was something happening inside my chest that was not the sharp, hot thing I might have expected, not the explosive, table-flipping kind of anger that the movies would have you believe is the natural response to a moment like this. It was colder than that, quieter. The kind of feeling that settles in behind your ribs and gets very comfortable and very patient because it understands that there is work to be done, and fury is not a tool. I thought about the crackers on the nightstand. I thought about Margaret's hands ice cold at 9 o'clock at night, shaking around a bowl of soup. I thought about 2 hours on a kitchen floor. Then I thought about family deserves memories, and something in me went very quiet and very clear, the way the air gets clear after a long storm has finally blown itself out. I picked up the phone. I did not call Kevin. I called the bank's customer service line, and when the automated system asked me what I needed, I said I need to speak with someone about freezing a supplemental card on my account. I was transferred in under a minute to a representative named David, and I explained the situation in the fewest words that would convey what I needed. David confirmed that as the primary account holder, I had full authority to freeze or permanently cancel any supplemental card at any time without notice to the cardholder. "Freeze it," I said. "Permanently. Effective immediately. And I need every future transaction to require my direct authorization." "Done," David said. "Is there anything else I can help you with today, Mr. Hayes?" "I need a complete transaction history for the past 12 weeks printed and mailed to my home address." "I can have that out within 2 business days." "Thank you." I hung up. Then I called Tasha's number and asked her to confirm she would be back at 7 the following morning. She said yes without hesitation. I called Nina and left a message asking her to begin Margaret's reassessment as soon as her schedule allowed. Then I opened my contacts and found Marcus Webb. Marcus and I had known each other for 22 years, since a job site in Pueblo, where we had both ended up working the same 6-month contract, and discovered we were both from Colorado, both terrible at poker, and both constitutionally incapable of walking past a barbecue joint without stopping. He had gone to law school at night, while I was learning industrial maintenance, and somewhere along the way, he had become one of the best civil attorneys in Denver without losing the ability to talk plainly to a person who needed plain talk. He picked up on the 3rd ring. "Walter, you're back early." "I am," I said. "Marcus, I need you to look at something for me." "How complicated?" I looked at the transaction history still open on my laptop screen. The numbers blurred slightly at the edges, and I blinked hard to clear them. "Complicated enough that I don't want to handle it without you," I said. "Kevin had a supplemental card on our household account. He used it while I was in Alaska." A pause. "How much?" "Everything in the screenshots I sent you," I said. "You've seen the number." The pause on Marcus's end was longer this time. When he spoke, his voice had shifted into the register I recognized as his working voice, careful, precise, already thinking 3 steps ahead. "Don't touch anything else in that account," he said. "Don't move money, don't close anything, don't confront Kevin yet. Screenshot every transaction and email them to me tonight. And Walter, yeah, don't call him, not yet." I looked at Kevin's grinning face, still visible on my phone screen, champagne light Caribbean sun, not a single thing to worry about. "I won't," I said. I ended the call. Upstairs, I could hear Tasha's voice, steady and calm, and Margaret answering her in short sentences that sounded stronger than they had the night before. I sat in the office chair for a moment longer, both hands resting on the desk, looking at nothing in particular. Then I typed out a text message to Kevin's number. Just one line. "Do not enter this house without my permission." I hit send. Then I began screenshotting every transaction on the account, one by one, methodical and unhurried, the way you do a job that matters. I finished screenshotting the last transaction at 11:47 that night. 83 screenshots in total. 83 individual charges spanning 11 weeks, ranging from a $14 pharmacy run that might have been legitimate to a $3,000 cabin upgrade that absolutely was not. I forwarded the entire folder to Marcus's email, added a brief note explaining the timeline, and set my phone on the desk. Then I sat there in the dark office for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just letting the quiet of the house settle around me. Upstairs, Tasha had helped Margaret through her evening routine and gotten her into bed before leaving at 9. The house was warm now. I had turned the heat up when I got back and ran a load of laundry and washed the dishes that had been sitting in the sink. Small things. The kind of things that do not fix anything, but give your hands something useful to do while your brain works through the larger problem. I went to bed just after midnight. I did not expect to sleep. I slept for 6 hours straight, which was more than I had managed in a single stretch for most of my time in Alaska. And I woke up at 6:15 to the sound of my phone vibrating against the nightstand like something trying to escape. Kevin. I looked at the name on the screen. My thumb hovered over it for exactly 3 seconds. Then I set it back down and went to brush my teeth. By the time I came back, there were 4 missed calls. By the time I had dressed and gone downstairs to start the coffee, there were 9. Jessica's name appeared twice in the middle of the sequence. Then Kevin's again, then Jessica, then Kevin in a run of 5, back-to-back, that suggested he was hitting redial the moment each call went to voicemail. I poured my coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching the morning come up over the back fence. 17 missed calls. Then 23. I watched the number climb, the way you watch weather move across an open field, with a kind of detached interest, noting the speed and direction, calculating where it was headed. 31. I picked up the phone and answered. Kevin's voice came through so loud, I had to hold the phone several inches from my ear. He was not speaking so much as detonating. "Dad, what did you do? The card isn't working. Jessica tried to use it at the restaurant last night and it declined in front of everybody. And this morning, the excursion company said our reservation was flagged and we have 2 more days on this ship, and there are still charges that need to go through. So whatever you did, you need to undo it right now." "Kevin," my voice came out quiet and level the way it does when I am working on a piece of machinery that requires precision, not forceful, just steady. "How much weight has your mother lost?" A sharp silence on the other end. I could hear wind in the background and voices and what sounded like the low rumble of the ship's engines. "What?" Kevin's voice shifted register from detonation to something more uncertain. "Your mother," I said. "How much weight has she lost since I've been gone, do you know?" "Dad, this isn't about Mom right now. This is about the card." "When did you cancel Tasha's contract?" I asked. The silence this time was different. Longer. The kind that has texture to it. "Dad, listen, that's complicated. There were reasons." "When did you tell Nina that we were having financial difficulties?" "I can explain that." Kevin. I set my coffee mug down on the counter very carefully because my hand had developed a slight tremor that I did not want to give in to. "Your mother fell 3 weeks ago. She was on that floor alone. Did you know that the wind on the other end of the line, the ship's engines, somebody laughing in the background, bright and distant. "She called me," Kevin said, and his voice had gone strange and flat. "She said she was okay." "She was on the floor," I said, "for 2 hours, and you told her to try to get herself up and that you'd check on her later." My voice stayed level. I was genuinely surprised by that at some distant observational part of myself. "You didn't go over." "Dad, $24,870, Kevin." Complete silence. "No, that's what's been charged to the household account since February." I picked up the coffee mug again because I needed something to hold. I counted 83 transactions. 83. "Do you want me to read them to you, or do you already know what they are?" "Dad." His voice cracked on the word. "Dad, I can explain." "When I don't want an explanation right now," I said. "I want you to understand that the card is frozen permanently. Any charge you attempt to put through on that account from this moment forward will be declined. If you have outstanding charges from the trip, you'll need to settle them with your own funds. We don't have—" He stopped himself. "I know," I said. A beat of silence. Then Kevin's voice came back, and it had shifted again, softer now, almost pleading. "Dad, Sophie's here. She doesn't need to be dealing with this right now. Can we talk about this when we get back? I'll come straight to the house, we'll sit down, I'll explain everything." "Sophie's been dealing with this the whole trip," I said. "She was there when her grandmother needed help and nobody came. She'll be fine." Kevin started to say something else. I spoke over him, not loudly, just clearly. "Come home, Kevin. Settle your bills. And when you get back, don't come to this house without calling me first." I ended the call. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, with the phone in my hand, listening to the silence of the house, which was not really silence at all. It was Tasha's car pulling into the driveway right on schedule, and the sound of Margaret moving upstairs, and somewhere down the street, a lawnmower starting up, the ordinary persistent sounds of a morning that intended to continue regardless of what any of us were going through. The phone buzzed again. Jessica this time. I let it go to voicemail. Then Kevin again. Voicemail. Then a number I did not recognize, which turned out to be one of Jessica's family members. Based on the voicemail, they left a woman's voice, tight and formal, asking me to please call back as soon as possible because there seemed to be some kind of misunderstanding. I deleted it. I went to the front door and opened it for Tasha, who took one look at my face and said, "Bad morning." "Productive one," I said. She laughed just briefly and stepped inside, and the sound of it was so unexpectedly normal that it loosened something in my chest that had been wound tight since the night before. "How is she?" Tasha asked, already moving toward the stairs with the calm efficiency of someone who understood that the most useful thing she could do was get to work. "Stronger," I said. "She ate a real breakfast." "Good." Tasha paused on the second stair and looked back at me. "Mr. Hayes, whatever you're handling, you're doing the right thing. I've worked with a lot of families, and sometimes the right thing looks very hard from the outside." I nodded once. She went upstairs. I went back to the office, sat down at the desk, and opened my laptop. Marcus had replied to my email at 6:43 that morning while I was still asleep. His message was 4 sentences long, which was about 3 more than he usually needed. "Walter got your screenshots. 11 weeks of transactions is significant. Before you do anything else, I need you to bring me the account statements and anything else you have in writing. There's something here that goes beyond a supplemental card being misused, and I want to look at it in person before either of us says another word to Kevin. Can you come to Denver tomorrow morning?" I read it twice. Then I typed back, "I'll be there at 9. I closed the laptop, stood up, and went to find Margaret. She was in the kitchen with Tasha sitting at the table with a cup of tea and a piece of toast, and the color in her face was visibly better than it had been 12 hours ago. She looked up when I walked in, and her eyes asked a question that her mouth did not. "Marcus wants to see me tomorrow," I said, sitting down across from her. "There's more to this than I thought." Margaret set her tea down. Her hands were steadier this morning, not steady, but steadier, which was enough for right now. Margaret looked at me across the table, the same woman who had held on through 9 weeks alone, and was still holding on now. "How much more?" she asked. I reached across the table and covered her hands with mine. "I don't know yet," I said honestly, "but I'm going to find out." Tasha left at 8:30, and the house went quiet in the particular way it does when it is just the two of you again. After a long time apart, not uncomfortable but weighted full of things still waiting to be said, I helped Margaret through her evening routine, the small, careful choreography of transfers and positioning that Tasha had walked me through before leaving. Margaret bore it with the patience she had developed over 8 months of recovery, guiding me when I hesitated, telling me quietly which way to angle the wheelchair, which grip worked better for her right side. She knew her own body better than anyone now. That knowledge had cost her something, and I felt the weight of that cost every time my hands had to do what my hands were never supposed to have to do alone. When she was settled in bed, propped against the pillows with the lamp on the nightstand, casting its familiar amber light across the room, she looked at me with an expression I recognized from 36 years of marriage, the look that meant she had been carrying something and had finally decided it was time to put it down. "I knew he took some money," she said. I was sitting in the chair beside the bed. I did not move. "How much did you think?" I asked. She pressed her lips together. "He told me a few thousand. He said the two of you had always helped each other out, that this was just a loan between family." Her voice caught on the last word, and she pushed through it. He said his marriage was in trouble, Walter. He said Jessica had been talking about leaving and that this trip might be the only thing that could pull them back together. He said Sophie needed to see her parents happy. My chest tightened so hard it was difficult to draw a full breath. "And you believed him," I said. Not an accusation, just the plain shape of what had happened. I believed him because I wanted to. Margaret's eyes filled and she did not bother trying to stop the tears. This time they ran freely down her face, and she let them. "He is my son, Walter. He sat right there where you're sitting, and he held my hand, and he told me that you would understand, that you always understood, that this was just the way family worked." Her voice broke open on the last sentence, cracking straight down the middle. And I was so tired. I was so tired, and I was so alone in this house, and I just wanted him to stay a little longer, so I said yes. I reached over and took her hand. Her fingers wrapped around mine immediately, holding on with a strength that surprised me given how thin her hands had become. "He told me not to tell you." She continued, her voice steadier now, something resolute moving underneath it. "He said you had enough to worry about up there. He said if I told you, you might lose focus and something might go wrong at the job site, and then, where would we be?" She shook her head slowly against the pillow. "Every time I picked up the phone to call you, I heard his voice in my head saying that. So I put the phone back down. I thought about all those evenings in Alaska, calling home Margaret's voice, always a little too measured, a little too careful. Kevin always had an answer ready. "Everything's fine, Dad. She's doing great, Dad." "Margaret?" My voice came out rougher than I intended. "I need you to know something. Whatever he told you, none of what happened is your fault." She squeezed my hand so hard her knuckles went pale. Fresh tears spilled over, and she pressed her free hand against her mouth shoulders, shaking with the effort of holding herself together. "I should have called you," she whispered. "The night I fell. The night I was on that floor. I should have called you the moment Kevin picked up the phone and said he was busy." Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "I kept thinking Walter is up there doing this for us. How do I call him and say I need more? Because that is exactly what I went up there for," I said. "Not the money. You. That is the only reason any of it mattered." She cried then. Not the broken, exhausted crying of the first night, but something cleaner and more direct. The kind that comes when a person has finally been given permission to stop pretending they are all right. I moved from the chair to sit on the edge of the bed beside her, and she leaned her head against my shoulder, and I put my arm around her, careful of her spine, and we stayed like that while the lamp burned low and the neighborhood outside went quiet. After a while, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Marcus. I picked it up with my free hand, careful not to disturb Margaret, and read the message. "Walter, before you come tomorrow, I need to ask you something. In the past 11 weeks, did you sign any financial documents, any authorization forms, anything at all with your signature on it?" I stared at the message for a long moment. Margaret had gone still against my shoulder, her breathing evening out towards sleep. I typed back with one thumb, "No. I was in Alaska. I didn't sign anything." Marcus's reply came in under a minute. "That's what I thought. Get here by 9, and bring your employment records from the North Slope, every last one." Before I tell you what Marcus found in that folder, something that changed everything, something I never saw coming, I need to know you're still here with me. If you're listening to this on Dad's Revenge Stories, drop the number 7 in the comments right now. Just the number. That's all I need to know you haven't left. And before we go further, this story contains fictional elements woven in for storytelling purposes. Some details have been shaped for this format. If that's not something you're comfortable with, it's completely okay to step away now, no hard feelings. Marcus Webb's office was on the 14th floor of a building on 17th Street in downtown Denver, with a view of the mountains that he claimed he never looked at anymore, because after 20 years, it just became wallpaper. I had always thought that was the saddest thing about success, the moment the extraordinary becomes ordinary without you noticing. I arrived at 8:52, with a folder of employment records from the North Slope contract tucked under my arm. Timesheets, badge, access logs, shift schedules, the complete documentation that the contracting company had emailed me at 6 that morning when I called and explained I needed them urgently. The woman on the phone had not asked why. People who work industrial contracts in remote locations understand that urgency sometimes arrives without explanation. Marcus was already at his desk when his assistant showed me in. He stood up when I entered, which he did not always do, and that small departure from habit told me more than anything he could have said. "Sit down, Walter," he said. I sat. He opened a manila folder on his desk and slid a single sheet of paper across to me. It was a financial authorization document, the kind of form that grants an individual expanded authority over a primary account holder's finances, allowing them to execute transactions above a certain threshold without direct approval. At the bottom of the page was a signature. My signature. Or something that looked enough like my signature to make my stomach drop straight to the floor. "Is that yours?" Marcus asked. I picked up the page and looked at it carefully. My name. My handwriting almost. The loop on the W was slightly too wide. The Y at the end of Hayes dropped at a different angle than mine always did. Whoever had done this was good. They had studied the real thing closely enough to reproduce the general shape of it, but I had been signing my name for 60 years. I knew every instinctive quirk of it, every place where my pen naturally lifted or pressed harder. This was not my hand. "No," I said. "That is not my signature." "You're certain?" Absolutely certain. Marcus nodded slowly, as though I had confirmed something he had already known. He reached into the folder and produced a second document, a printout from the bank showing the date this authorization form had been received and processed. "This form was submitted to your bank on March 7th, he said. It granted Kevin Hayes expanded transaction authority on the household account, specifically allowing him to execute single transactions up to $15,000 without requiring your direct confirmation. The bank accepted it because it appeared to be properly signed and notarized." I stared at the date. March 7th. Marcus. My voice came out very quiet. On March 7th, I was in the middle of a 12-hour shift at the Prudhoe Bay facility on the North Slope. I badged into the restricted equipment zone at 6:44 in the morning and did not badge out until 6:51 that evening. I opened my folder and pulled out the badge access log, a computer-generated record showing every time my employee ID card had been scanned at a security checkpoint. I slid it across the desk. I was inside a locked facility. My personal phone was in a locker. I could not have signed anything on March 7th. I was not in the same time zone. Marcus looked at the log for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "That," he said carefully, "is what we call an alibi." "What does this mean legally?" I asked. In plain language. Marcus leaned back in his chair and laced his fingers together. "In plain language, someone created a document bearing your forged signature and submitted it to a financial institution to obtain expanded financial authority. Under Colorado Revised Statutes, Section 18-5-102, that is forgery. It is a Class 5 felony. It carries a potential sentence of 1 to 3 years and fines up to $100,000. He paused. "This is no longer a family dispute about a supplemental card being misused, Walter. This is a criminal matter." The word criminal sat in the room between us with considerable weight. I pressed both hands flat on my knees and looked out the window at the mountains Marcus claimed had become wallpaper. They had not become wallpaper to me. They looked the way they always looked, enormous and indifferent, and completely unchanged by whatever small disasters were unfolding at their feet. "Who do I report this to?" I asked. "That is a conversation we need to have carefully," Marcus said. "Because reporting it has consequences that move in more than one direction, and I want you to understand all of them before you decide anything." He picked up a pen and turned it slowly between his fingers. "The bank will want to conduct their own investigation. Depending on what they find, they may involve law enforcement directly. There may also be a question of the notarization on this document. If someone notarized a forged signature, that person has their own legal exposure. Do you know if Kevin has any connection to a notary?" I thought about it. Jessica's sister Melissa had been a notary public for years. She used it for her real estate work. I had known that for as long as Kevin and Jessica had been married. I told Marcus. He wrote it down without reacting the way good attorneys write things down, like every piece of information is equally important, until proven otherwise. "There's one more thing," Marcus said. He reached into the folder a final time and produced a printout of a photograph. It was a screenshot of something, a document visible on a computer screen, slightly blurry at the edges, the way photos taken of screens always are. One of the bank's compliance officers flagged this during their preliminary review. This image was sent in an email from Kevin's address to someone on Jessica's side of the family approximately 10 weeks ago. I leaned forward and looked at the image. It appeared to be a scan of the authorization form, my forged signature clearly visible with a caption typed beneath it. The caption read, "Finally have things sorted out on Dad's end. He's on board with everything." My jaw tightened until the muscles along my cheekbone ached. "He showed it to people." I said. Teasing. He appears to have used it to reassure Jessica's family that the cruise expenditures had your approval, Marcus said. Which means there are potentially multiple people who received communications implying your consent to transactions you never authorized. I sat back in the chair. The mountains outside were still there, still enormous, still completely unmoved. What do I do right now? I asked. Today, this morning. What is the single most useful thing I can do? Marcus did not hesitate. Go home, he said. Take care of your wife. Let me make some calls. And Walter. He met my eyes directly. Change the garage code. Tonight. I changed the front door lock the moment I got home from Denver. Then I changed the back door. Then the side entrance off the laundry room. I went through the house methodically, the way I approached any maintenance job. Start at the perimeter. Perimeter work inward. Do not stop until every point of entry is accounted for. I almost changed the garage code. Almost. I was standing in the garage with the keypad cover open, the instruction manual in my hand, when Tasha called up from the kitchen, asking if I wanted coffee before she left for the evening. I set the manual on the workbench and went inside. By the time I finished talking to Tasha, finished helping Margaret with dinner, finished sitting with her while she fell asleep, the garage code had slipped entirely from my mind. That was the only mistake I made. At 1:14 in the morning, my phone buzzed on the nightstand, with a motion alert from the garage camera, a system I had installed 2 summers ago after a neighbor's truck got broken into. A basic setup with a wide-angle lens mounted above the shelving unit on the far wall. I had forgotten it was there. Apparently so had Kevin. I picked up the phone and opened the app. The garage was dark, except for the faint green glow of the camera's night vision. A figure was moving along the far wall, and even in the washed-out monochrome of the footage, I recognized my son's walk, that particular forward lean he had carried since high school. Like he was always slightly ahead of himself. Kevin crossed to the old workbench where I kept a row of filing boxes and the spare laptop I had used before the company issued me a newer one 2 years ago. He opened the laptop, looked at the screen for a moment, then tucked it under his arm. The whole thing took less than 3 minutes. Then he walked back to the garage door, ducked under it, and was gone. Margaret's voice came from behind me, rough with interrupted sleep. Walter, what is it? Bobbin. Kevin was just in the garage, I said. I kept my voice even, which required more effort than I expected. He took the old laptop. Margaret pushed herself upright against the headboard, her eyes wide and sharp despite the hour. Why didn't you go down and stop him? I looked at the frozen image on my phone, the empty garage, the workbench drawer still half open, where Kevin had pulled it out. Because he just told me exactly what he's afraid of, I said. Margaret stared at me. The laptop has something on it. The laptop has almost nothing on it, I said. I cleared it and transferred everything to the new machine the day I got home. Whatever Kevin thinks is on that computer, it isn't there anymore. I set my phone on the nightstand. But the camera recorded every second of him walking into this house at 1 in the morning, after I sent him a text message telling him not to enter without my permission. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes filled immediately, not with sadness, but with something sharper, the particular anguish of a mother watching her child make the worst possible version of every available choice. "Oh, Kevin," she whispered, and the way she said it broke my heart clean in half. Not anger, just grief, the bottomless, specific grief of loving someone who keeps reaching for the match while standing in a room full of gasoline. I picked up my phone and forwarded the camera footage to Marcus's email with a single line of text. He came to the house tonight. Garage. 1 a.m. Full video attached. Marcus replied at 6:41 the next morning. His message was 4 words. This changes everything, Walter. Marcus called at 7:15, not texted. When Marcus called instead of texting, it meant the situation had moved into territory that required actual words spoken out loud in real time. I was already dressed and downstairs when my phone rang, standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee I had not touched yet. "Ituku, the video is solid," he said, skipping past any greeting. "Unauthorized entry following a written warning. Colorado criminal trespass, class 5 felony, same category as the forgery charge. I've already spoken with a contact at the DA's office, not filing anything yet, just establishing the record. What I need from you today is everything on the home computer. Every file, every folder, every piece of metadata you can pull." "I'll look this morning," I said. "Don't just look. Copy everything to an external drive and bring it to me. And Walter, don't delete anything. Don't reorganize anything. Touch as little as possible. The metadata, the information embedded in each file that records when it was created, when it was modified, and under which user account, that is potentially more valuable than the document itself. I understood metadata in the general sense that anyone who has worked with computers for 20 years understands it. But Marcus explained it the way he explained everything that mattered, simply without condescension, making sure I had the full picture before he hung up. Every document created on a computer carries an invisible record. The date it was made, the time it was last opened, the name of the user account that created it. If someone had used our home computer to create a document designed to look like my signature, and if they had been careless enough to do it without wiping that record afterward, the evidence would still be sitting in the file's own history, quiet and patient, waiting for someone to look. I went to the office and opened the laptop. It took me 40 minutes of careful searching, moving through folders I had not opened in months before I found it. A document in a subfolder inside the general household files, labeled with a name that looked administrative and forgettable, the kind of file name a person chooses when they want something to disappear into the background noise of an ordinary folder. But the file itself, when I right-clicked and opened its properties, told a different story. Created February 19th. Modified March 4th. February 19th was 3 days after I had flown to Alaska. I sat very still and looked at the screen for a long moment. My coffee had gone completely cold. Outside, a car went past on the street, and a dog somewhere down the block was barking at something with the dedicated outrage that only dogs and toddlers can sustain for more than 30 seconds. I did not open the document. Marcus had been clear about that. Do not open anything. You don't need to open, because opening a file updates its metadata, and updated metadata is a defense attorney's best friend. I copied the entire folder to the external hard drive I kept in the filing cabinet, labeled the drive with a piece of masking tape and a marker, and put it in my jacket pocket. Then my phone started ringing. Not Kevin this time. A number I recognized as belonging to Jessica's aunt, a woman I had met at their wedding 11 years ago and perhaps 4 times since. I let it go to voicemail. Then Kevin's cousin on his mother's side. Voicemail. Then a number I did not recognize at all, which left a message in a voice I eventually placed as belonging to one of Jessica's co-workers, who had apparently been told enough of a story to feel compelled to weigh in. I listened to each voicemail exactly once. The story being circulated was consistent in its broad strokes, which told me it had been constructed carefully and distributed deliberately. Walter had come back from Alaska in a disturbed state. Walter had frozen family funds without warning or justification. Walter was isolating Margaret from the people who loved her. Walter might need help that he was refusing to seek. I wrote down every name, every number, every timestamp. Then I went upstairs to check on Margaret, who was in the middle of her morning session with Tasha, moving through a series of careful exercises with the focused expression she always got when she was working hard at something she refused to let beat her. She looked up when I appeared in the doorway. "You look like you found something," she said. "I found something," I confirmed. Tasha glanced at me over Margaret's shoulder, read whatever was on my face, and said quietly, "We're almost done here. Give us 10 minutes. I nodded and went back downstairs. I called Marcus and told him about the file. "February 19th, he said, and I could hear him writing. "3 days after your departure. Modified March 4th, 3 days before the authorization form was submitted to the bank." A pause that had the texture of something clicking into place. "That is not a coincidence, Walter." "No," I said. "It isn't. Bring the drive when you come in. I'll have my tech consultant look at it tomorrow." Another pause. "How are you holding up?" It was such a straightforward question, and so unexpected coming from Marcus, who was not generally given to asking about feelings, that it caught me off guard for a moment. "I'm holding up," I said. "Good." His voice shifted back to its working register. "One more thing. Change the garage code. I know I said it before." "Already done," I said. "First thing this morning." "Good man," Marcus said, and hung up. She called on a Thursday morning 2 days after the cruise ship docked in Miami. I knew they were back, because Kevin's car had driven slowly past our house twice the previous evening. I had seen it from the upstairs window, that gray Accord, moving at the careful speed of someone who wants to see without being seen. I had not gone to the window to let him know I had noticed. I just watched the car complete its pass and disappear around the corner, and then I went back to helping Margaret with her evening exercises. Jessica's voice on the phone was not what I expected. I had braced for anger or tears or the particular brand of entitled indignation that she occasionally deployed when she felt cornered. What I got instead was something quieter and more careful, a controlled voice, the voice of someone who had spent the past 2 days thinking very hard about exactly what they were going to say. "Walter, I think we need to talk. Just the two of us. Without Kevin." That last part told me everything about where things stood between the two of them. "All right," I said. "Where?" She named a coffee shop on College Avenue, a place I knew, small, usually quiet on weekday mornings, the kind of establishment that had been in Fort Collins long enough to become invisible to people who had grown up there. Neutral ground. She had chosen it deliberately, and I noted that. We met at 10 o'clock. Jessica was already there when I arrived. Sitting at a corner table with a latte, she had not touched her hands wrapped around the cup, the way Margaret had wrapped her hands around the soup bowl on my first night home. The comparison was not lost on me, though the situations were about as different as two things could be while still involving the same gesture. She looked exhausted. The cruise tan was still on her face, which created a dissonance that I suspected she was aware of the sun-warmed skin of a woman who had just spent 10 days in the Caribbean, sitting across from the man whose money had paid for it, while his wife ate crackers alone in a cold house. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You said you wanted to talk," I said. "I'm listening." She pulled her phone from her bag and set it on the table between us. Her hands were steady, but there was a tightness around her eyes that told me the steadiness was costing her something. "I want you to understand that I didn't know the full picture," she began. "Kevin told me you had agreed to contribute to the trip. He said it was his way of giving something back to my family after everything they'd done to help while you were in Alaska. He said you two had discussed it." "We didn't discuss it," I said. "I know that now." She pushed the phone slightly toward me. "I want to show you something. I want you to see what Kevin was telling me because I think you believe I was more involved in the planning than I was." She opened the Messages app and found a thread between herself and Kevin. She scrolled to a section from approximately 10 weeks earlier and turned the phone so I could read it. The messages were exactly what she wanted me to see. Kevin's side of the conversation was damning in the particular way that messages written without any expectation of ever being read by the wrong person are damning, casual, confident, completely unguarded. One message read, "Dad won't check the account until I get back. He never does when he's on a long contract." Another, "He trusts me with this stuff. Always has." A third sent the week before they boarded the ship, "If anything gets complicated when we're on the water, I'll handle Mom." She won't say anything. My jaw tightened so hard that the muscles along my cheekbone began to ache. I'll handle Mom. My wife of 36 years reduced in her own son's private messages to an obstacle to be managed. I kept my face still and my hands flat on the table. Jessica was watching me read, tracking my expression, with the careful attention of someone waiting to see which way a situation was going to break. I reached the end of the messages she had indicated and kept scrolling upward past the point where she had stopped. That was when I found it. 4 weeks before the cruise. Jessica's message to Kevin time-stamped on a Wednesday afternoon. It read, "If we're already cutting the caregiver costs, can we put that money toward upgrading the cabin? The standard rooms are so small." I read it twice. Then I set the phone down on the table and looked at Jessica directly for the first time since I had sat down. The color had drained from her face so completely that the tan looked painted on a detail from a different day, applied to a face that had just understood what it had done. "Walter, She reached for the phone. I didn't know that cutting the caregiver meant leaving Margaret without." "You knew there was a caregiver," I said. My voice came out very quiet, which was the only register I trusted myself to use at that moment. "You knew the money being saved was money that had been designated for my wife's care. You asked to redirect it toward a cabin upgrade." I let that sit for exactly 1 beat. "That's what I read." Kevin told me it was being handled another way. Her voice cracked on the word handled, and her eyes filled, and she pressed her fingers against her mouth. "He said your sister-in-law was covering it. He said Margaret didn't need as much help anymore." "Margaret fell," I said. "She was on that floor alone for a very long time." Jessica made a sound that was not quite a word, a sharp, involuntary exhalation, like someone who has walked into something in the dark. "I didn't know," she whispered. The tears were running freely now, cutting through the tan, and I believed her distress was real. I also believed it did not change what her message said. I stood up. "Jessica." I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. "You didn't come here today to give me the truth. You came because you're afraid that when this is all sorted out, Kevin is going to pull you down with him." I looked at her directly. "That's a reasonable fear, but it's not something I can help you with." I left. I got home from College Avenue just before noon. The house smelled different than it had a week ago. Not the stale, heavy smell of neglect that had hit me the moment I opened the door on my first night back, but something warmer and more ordinary. Tasha had opened the kitchen window before leaving that morning, and the Colorado spring air had come through and done what it always does, reminded everything inside that the world outside was still moving, still breathing, still carrying on regardless. Margaret was at the kitchen table when I walked in, a cup of tea in front of her, and a physical therapy handout spread across the placemat exercises Nina had sent home for her to practice between sessions. She had been working through them on her own. That detail landed in my chest, like something solid and warm, the particular pride of watching someone fight for themselves when nobody is making them. She looked up when she heard the door. "How did it go?" she asked. I hung my jacket on the hook by the door, the one I had put up 17 years ago, when we realized the front closet was never going to be big enough for two people's coats. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She knew, I said. 2 words. Margaret absorbed them the way she absorbed most difficult things, without flinching, without immediate reaction, letting them settle into their full weight before she responded. How much did she know? She asked. Enough. I told her about the messages. Kevin's side first, the casual confidence of a man who had never imagined his own words being read by the wrong person. Dad won't check the account. He trusts me. I'll handle Mom. Margaret's expression tightened incrementally, with each one a slow gathering of something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived in the narrow space between the two. Then I told her about Jessica's message, the one about the caregiver costs and the cabin upgrade. Margaret set her tea down very carefully, with the deliberate steadiness of someone making sure their hands do not betray them. She asked to use the money from Tasha's contract, Margaret said. Her voice was flat in the way that flat voices get when they are covering something that has no clean outlet. The money that was supposed to be for my care. Yes, she pressed both hands flat on the table and stared at them for a moment. Her knuckles were still bonier than they should have been. The weight she had lost did not come back in a week, no matter how well Tasha fed her or how faithfully she did her exercises. Some things took the time they took. I don't know how to feel about that, she said finally. I've been trying to figure it out since you left this morning, and I still don't know. You don't have to know yet, I said. You don't have to feel any particular way about any of this on anyone else's schedule. She looked up at me, and her eyes were bright and dry. She had done her crying for now, and what was left was something steadier and more complicated than tears. What happens next? Legally, I mean. Marcus is handling it. The forgery, the trespass, the disputed transactions, he's working through the right channels. He'll call when there's something concrete. I paused. There may be an investigation. There may not be, depending on what the bank decides to pursue directly. Either way, it moves slowly. Margaret nodded. She picked up her tea again, wrapped both hands around the mug the way she had all week, like warmth was still something she needed to hold on to deliberately. What about Sophie? She asked. There it was. The question I had been sitting with since the night before. I've tried calling her twice, I said. Both times it went straight to voicemail. Kevin may have her phone or she may have it silenced, I don't know. I looked at the table. She was on that ship for 10 days, Margaret. She's 16 years old. Whatever she saw, whatever she heard, she's been carrying it without anyone to talk to about it. Margaret's jaw tightened. She set the mug down again and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard where the grass was still too long, and the old bird feeder I kept meaning to refill was hanging empty from the elm tree near the fence. She looked wrong on that last FaceTime, Margaret said quietly. Before they left. She was smiling, but it didn't reach her eyes. I noticed it, and I told myself I was being a nervous grandmother. She shook her head slowly. I should have said something. So should I said. We both let ourselves believe what was easier to believe. We sat with that for a moment, not comfortably, but honestly, which is the only way to sit with things that are true and painful at the same time. Then my phone buzzed on the table between us. An unknown number. No area code I recognized. A text message, short and careful, the kind of message written by someone who had been thinking about what to say for a long time before they said it. Grandpa. It's Sophie. I'm using a friend's phone. Can I talk to you? I was on my feet before I had finished reading it. Margaret leaned forward, trying to read the screen. I turned it toward her and watched her face change, the tightness around her eyes, releasing all at once, replaced by something that was equal parts relief and heartbreak, the particular expression of a grandmother who has been worried about a child and has just learned the child is reachable. "Call her," Margaret said. Her voice was rough. "Right now. Call her." I typed back, "Yes. Call me right now. I'm here." The three dots appeared immediately. Sophie was already typing back, already on the other end of whatever connection she had managed to build across the distance of the past week. The dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again, the small digital pulse of a 16-year-old girl trying to figure out exactly how to begin. I pulled out the chair beside Margaret and sat down close enough that she could hear if I put the phone between us. And we waited. The phone rang 11 seconds after I sent my reply. I answered it on the first ring and put it on speaker, setting it on the table between me and Margaret so we could both hear. Sophie's voice came through immediately, slightly breathless, like she had been holding it together for a long time, and the simple act of the call connecting had loosened something. "Grandpa," one word. But the way she said it, the relief packed into those two syllables, the way her voice dropped on the second one, like she was finally setting something heavy down, told me more than a paragraph could have. "I'm here," I said. "Margaret's here too. You're on speaker." A sharp intake of breath. "Grandma." Her voice cracked open on the second syllable, cracked clean through, and I heard her press her hand over her mouth to muffle the sound that came after. Margaret leaned toward the phone. Her eyes were already wet, her chin trembling with the effort of holding herself steady. "I'm right here, sweetheart. I'm right here." Sophie made a sound that was not quite a word, a small broken exhalation, pure relief, the kind that can only come from someone who has been frightened for a long time and has just been told the thing they were frightened of did not happen. She cried for a moment, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind, the kind teenagers cry when they have been trying very hard not to for too long. "I'm sorry," she managed. "I'm so sorry I didn't call sooner. Dad has my phone. Caitlin let me use hers during lunch, and I have maybe 20 minutes before she needs it back." "Don't apologize," I said. "You called. That's what matters. Is Grandma okay?" The urgency in her voice was sharp and direct. Like actually okay, not just okay, because Dad kept saying she was fine every time I asked, which I knew. That wasn't the real answer, because he'd changed the subject every single time, and Dad only changes the subject when he doesn't want to answer the actual question. Margaret let out a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob. "I'm getting better, Sophie. Tasha's back. Nina's back. I'm eating real food and doing my exercises." Her voice steadied as she spoke, gaining something from the act of saying it out loud. "I'm going to be okay." Another rush of breath from Sophie's end. "Okay. Okay, good. Okay." She said it 3 times, each one slightly different. The first was relief. The second was convincing herself. The third was something that sounded like the beginning of being able to breathe normally again. "Sophie," I said gently. "You said you saw things on the trip. Tell me what you want to tell me. Take your time." A pause. I could hear her gathering herself on the other end, the particular quiet of a 16-year-old deciding how honest to be with an adult she trusted. "The whole trip felt wrong," she said finally. "From like the first day. Mom and Dad were fighting, but like quietly. The kind of fighting where they're being really careful about their voices because other people are around, but you can still hear it because you grew up in the same house, and you know exactly what their fight voices sound like even when they're trying to hide them." Margaret reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "What were they fighting about?" I asked. "Money mostly, and then you." She hesitated. Dad kept saying that Grandpa would handle it. That you always handled it. Like it was just a fact. A thing that was always true and would always be true, so nothing that happened was actually a problem, because Grandpa would fix it in the end. Her voice shifted, became more uncertain. I kept thinking about Grandma. I kept thinking if Grandpa's up in Alaska and Dad's on a boat in the Caribbean, then who's at home with Grandma? And I tried to ask Dad about it, and he just said she was fine. She had people checking on her. Everything was arranged. It wasn't arranged, I said quietly. I know that now. Her voice tightened. I think I knew something was wrong then too. On the last FaceTime before we left Grandma, you were wearing Grandpa's old sweatshirt, and you kept saying you were fine, but your voice sounded tired in a way that wasn't just regular tired. And I almost said something. I was right there. I had my phone in my hand. I could have called Grandpa and told him what I was seeing. A long pause. I didn't. I was scared Dad would find out and be angry, and I told myself I was probably overreacting, and I didn't. Sophie. My voice came out steadier than I expected. You were 16 years old on that ship with no way to know how serious things were. You were in an impossible position that was never yours to be in. Do you understand that? A shaky exhale. Yeah, I'm trying to. Keep trying, I said, because it's true. Silence for a moment, the comfortable kind, not the strained kind. Then Sophie spoke again, her voice dropping slightly. Grandpa, the last few nights on the ship, Dad kept going out to the balcony by himself. Really late. Like 2 or 3 in the morning. I could see him from my room because our balconies were next to each other. She paused. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't doing anything. He just sat out there in the dark and looked at the water. For hours, sometimes. Another pause, smaller. He looked scared, not angry scared, just scared. Like someone who knows they did something they can't undo. I held that image carefully in my mind. My son alone on a ship's deck at 3 in the morning, somewhere in the dark water between one life and whatever came next. I know, I said. Is he going to be okay? She asked. And the way she asked it, not with anger, not with judgment, but with the genuine worried love of a daughter for a father she did not entirely understand, made my throat tighten so hard I had to wait a beat before I could answer. That depends on him, I said honestly, and on choices he makes from here. Sophie took that in quietly. Then, tell Grandma I love her. Tell her I'm sorry I wasn't there. I looked at Margaret, who had been listening with tears running freely and unchecked down her face, her hand still covering mine on the table. Tell her yourself, I said. She's right here. I slid the phone across to Margaret. She picked it up with both trembling hands, brought it to her ear, and said her granddaughter's name, just that, just Sophie, and her voice broke completely on the single word cracked open from the inside, and she pressed her free hand flat against her chest, as if she could hold herself together that way. They talked for 11 minutes. I sat across the table and did not listen to the words. Only the tones, Margaret's voice moving from broken to warm, to something that sounded by the end almost like ordinary. Sophie's voice doing the same thing in its own register, the tightness leaving it gradually, the way tension leaves a room when the right window is finally opened. When Margaret handed the phone back to me, her face was wet and her eyes were red, but her shoulders had come down from around her ears and her hands had stopped shaking. She's a good kid, she said. Her voice was rough and soft at the same time. She is, I said. I brought the phone back to my ear. Sophie, thank you for calling. You did the right thing. Take care of Grandma, she said, and then quieter, Take care of yourself too, Grandpa. The call ended. I set the phone on the table. Outside, the afternoon had shifted toward the long, golden light of a Colorado spring evening. The kind that turns ordinary things, the elm tree in the backyard, the too long grass, the empty bird feeder, into something that looks briefly like a painting of itself. Margaret was looking out the window at it, still wet-faced, still soft around the edges, in the way people get after they have cried properly and been met properly on the other side. Then I heard a car door close out front. One door, just one. I went to the front window and looked out. Kevin was standing on the sidewalk in front of our house, alone, hands in the pockets of his jacket, looking up at the front door with an expression I had not seen on his face in a very long time. Not anger, not calculation, not the practiced deflection he had been deploying since the moment I came home. Just a man standing outside a door that used to open for him, automatically understanding for the first time that it no longer did. I watched him from the front window for 2 full minutes before I opened the door. Not because I needed time to compose myself. I had been composing myself for 10 days in the quiet, methodical way that a person composes themselves when they know a confrontation is coming and they want to meet it standing up straight. I watched him because I wanted to understand what I was looking at before I responded to it. Kevin had his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the front door, and he was not moving, not pacing, not checking his phone, not rehearsing something under his breath the way he used to do before difficult conversations when he was a teenager. A habit I had always found oddly endearing. He was just standing there on the sidewalk in the thin afternoon light, looking at the door of the house he had grown up in, and the stillness of him told me more than any amount of motion could have. He was not here to fight. I went to the door and opened it. Kevin looked up. Something moved across his face. Relief, I thought, followed immediately by something more complicated. He took his hands out of his pockets and let them hang at his sides. "Dad." His voice came out quieter than I expected. Quieter than it had been on the phone from the Caribbean, quieter than the angry voicemails, quieter than the version of my son I had been dealing with for the past 10 days. "Can I come in?" I stepped out onto the porch instead of stepping aside. Kevin registered the distinction. I saw it in the way his shoulders moved, a small, involuntary adjustment, like a man recalibrating his expectations in real time. "Okay," he said. He looked at the porch railing, then back at me. "Okay, out here is fine." The Colorado afternoon was cool, but not cold. The kind of spring day that can't quite decide what it wants to be. A neighbor's kid was riding a bike down the sidewalk, 2 houses over the wheels, making that particular clicking sound of a bike that needs its chain oiled. Somewhere up the street, somebody's wind chimes were going. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary afternoon. And my son standing in front of me looking like he had not slept properly in 2 weeks, which I suspected was true. "Jessica and I are having serious problems," he said. He was not looking for sympathy when he said it. His voice was flat, reporting a fact. "The trip made things worse instead of better. She's talking to a lawyer." "I know," I said. He looked up at me. "How?" "Because people who are scared of being blamed for things they did tend to start building their case early," I said. "Jessica came to see me 4 days ago." Kevin absorbed that. His jaw tightened, then released. "What did she tell you?" "Enough," I said. "And she showed me enough." He nodded slowly, looking back at the porch railing. His hands had found their way back into his jacket pockets. I recognized the gesture. He had done it since he was 12 years old, the hands in pockets retreat that meant he was feeling cornered and was trying not to show it. "Dad, I'm in a bad place financially." He said it the way a man says something he has rehearsed and hates the sound of. The trip put us in a hole we can't climb out of on our own. The credit cards are nearly maxed. There are still charges from the cruise that came through after the card situation. He paused. I need help. I looked at my son. I thought about the version of myself that had existed for 35 years, the one who would have said how much before he finished the sentence. The one who would have been quietly calculating what he could transfer without Margaret noticing, telling himself it was a loan, telling himself this was the last time, telling himself that this was what fathers did. That version of me had driven to the bank more times than I could count, had written checks he never saw repaid, had filed the losses under love and moved on. No, I said. Kevin blinked. Just once, like the word had taken a moment to register. Dad. No, I said again. Not louder, not harder. Just the same word, the same tone held firm. Kevin's jaw worked. He looked away down the street toward where the kid on the bike had disappeared around the corner. When he looked back, his eyes were red at the rims, not crying, not yet, but close enough to it that I could see the effort it was taking him not to be. I'll pay you back, he said. I know I've said that before, but this time, like the other times, I asked. He stopped. The wind chimes up the street kept going. The afternoon light shifted slightly the way it does in Colorado when a cloud moves across without committing to anything. Kevin looked at his shoes for a long moment. When he raised his head, something in his face had changed. The practiced deflection was gone, and what was underneath it was rawer and less managed than anything I had seen from him since he was a small boy who had broken something and couldn't figure out how to tell me. I held his gaze and said the thing I had been carrying since the night I came home to a dark house and a cold wife and a refrigerator with 3 eggs and a jar of mustard. Kevin. My voice came out low and steady. The worst part of all of this, the part that keeps me awake at 3 in the morning, it is not the money. I can earn money back. I have done it before, and I can do it again. I paused, making sure he was with me. What I cannot get back is 9 weeks of your mother sitting alone in this house, in the cold, eating crackers off a nightstand, believing with everything she had that she was a burden to every single person who was supposed to love her. Kevin's throat moved. She fell, I said. She was on the kitchen floor for 2 hours. She called you. His eyes went fully red. He pressed his lips together so hard the color left them. I know, he said. The words came out broken at the edges, barely held together. She didn't call me, I continued, because you told her not to. Because you told her that calling me might cost us everything we'd been working for. And she believed you because she is your mother, and mothers believe their children even when they shouldn't. Kevin's chin dropped. His shoulders, which had been held carefully straight since the moment I opened the door, began to curve inward slowly, the way a structure settles when the thing holding it up finally gives. Dad. His voice had dropped to almost nothing. I know what I did. Do you? I asked, not cruelly, genuinely. He raised his head and looked at me, and his eyes were wet now, the tears sitting right at the edge, and his face had the particular stripped-down expression of a man who has run out of versions of himself to hide behind. Yeah, he said. I do. He stood there on my porch in the afternoon light, 35 years old, my son, and he said something that I had not heard from him in so long I had stopped expecting it. Dad, I don't need money. I looked at my son. I need help. His voice was stripped of everything, the practiced confidence, the deflection, the easy charm that had gotten him out of tight corners his entire adult life. What was left underneath all of it was something I had not seen in a very long time. Something that looked, if I was being honest, like the 12-year-old boy who had once broken the rear windshield of our station wagon with a baseball and had stood in the driveway for 45 minutes trying to figure out how to tell me. Not the kind of help where you write a check and I say I'll pay you back and we both pretend that fixes it. The other kind. I did not speak. I let him continue. I haven't slept more than 3 hours in a row since we got on that ship. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment, steadying himself. I kept thinking about Mom. Every night I'd tell myself she was fine, that it was all arranged, that I'd sort everything out when we got back. And then I'd go out on the balcony and sit there because I couldn't be in the room with Jessica, and I couldn't sleep, and I just... His voice cracked, completely broke open, and he stopped talking and pressed both hands flat over his face and stood there shaking on my front porch, like a man trying to hold himself together with his bare hands. I waited. He dropped his hands after a moment. His face was wet, his eyes were red, and he was breathing in the careful, deliberate way of someone who has decided they are going to get through a sentence, no matter what it costs them. Every time I got into trouble, you fixed it, he said. Every single time. The credit card when I was 22, the car, the business. Every time I fell, you were already there before I hit the ground. He looked at me directly. I think I stopped learning how to catch myself. I think I stopped believing I had to, because you were always going to be there. His chin trembled violently, and he pushed through it. And this time I used that. I used you, and Mom paid for it. And Sophie paid for it. And I don't know how to live with that yet. The wind chimes up the street, the afternoon light going gold across the porch boards. I looked at my son for a long moment. I still loved him. That was the hardest part. Not the money, not the forgery, not any of it. The hardest part was standing here with all of it between us and still loving him the way I had loved him since the moment I held him in a hospital in Fort Collins 35 years ago, and understood for the first time what the word helpless really meant. But love I had learned 10 days ago was not the same thing as rescue. I reached into my back pocket and took out my wallet. Not for cash. I found the small card I had put there 2 days earlier after a conversation with Marcus, in which he had mentioned almost in passing the name of a counselor he had referred other clients to. A man who worked specifically with people navigating the intersection of financial crisis and family breakdown. I held the card out. Kevin looked at it, then at me. That is a counselor, I said. His name is Dr. Alan Pritchard. He's in Denver. Marcus has worked with him before. I kept the card extended between us. That is all I'm giving you right now, Kevin. Not money, not a solution, just that. Kevin reached out and took the card with fingers that were not entirely steady. He looked at it for a long moment, turning it over once, then held it carefully, like something he did not want to drop. Okay, he said quietly. He put the card in his jacket pocket. Then he looked up at me one last time, and his face had something on it that I did not have a clean word for, not forgiveness, not resolution, nothing that tied anything together neatly. Just the raw, uncertain expression of a man taking the first step of a very long walk without any idea where it ended. Tell Mom I'm sorry, he said. Not don't make it a thing. Just tell her. Tell her yourself, I said. When you're ready to mean it. He nodded once, turned, walked back down the porch steps to his car. I stood on the porch and watched the gray Accord pull away from the curb and move slowly down the street until it turned the corner and disappeared. I did not feel like I had won anything. I felt tired and sad and more certain than I had been about anything in years. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Marcus. The bank finished their review. Call me when you can. I called Marcus from the kitchen table while Margaret was in the living room with Nina working through her afternoon exercises. I could hear Nina's voice through the wall, steady, encouraging, counting out repetitions with the patient precision of someone who understood that recovery was not a straight line, but a series of small insistences against gravity. Every few minutes I heard Margaret's voice, shorter, more effortful, pushing back. That sound kept me from feeling sorry for myself while Marcus talked. The bank completed their review, he said. Here is where we are. The forged authorization document has been flagged and referred to the DA's office. That process moves on its own timeline. Now you don't control it, and you don't need to. The garage entry footage has been logged as supporting evidence for criminal trespass. Both matters are documented and moving through the right channels. What about the money? I asked. Some of it is recoverable. Some of it is not. He said it the way he said everything difficult plainly, without softening it into something it wasn't. The transactions Kevin made using the forged authorization, those have a strong dispute basis. The bank is treating those as unauthorized. You will likely recover a significant portion. A pause. The transactions made using the legitimate supplemental card are harder. Kevin had legal access to that card. You gave it to him. The fact that he used it in ways you never intended is a civil matter, not a banking dispute. So I'd have to sue him, I said. You could. At $24,000, it falls under district court jurisdiction in Colorado, above the small claims limit of $7,500. It would take time and money, and it would put everything in front of a judge, which means it becomes a matter of public record. Another pause. Walter, I need to ask you something directly. What do you actually want out of this? I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard. The grass was cut now. I had finally gotten to it 3 days ago, pushing the mower in the late afternoon, while Margaret watched from the kitchen window, and afterward she had told me it looked good, and I had believed her because she had never once, in 36 years, told me something looked good when it didn't. I want Margaret to be okay, I said. I want Tasha to keep coming. I want Nina to keep coming. I want the forgery addressed through the right channels because what Kevin did was wrong, and it needs a record. I paused. I don't want to spend the next 2 years in a courtroom. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, you can spend $20,000 chasing $10,000 if you're emotionally committed enough. That is not legal advice. That is life advice with a billing rate attached. Despite everything, I almost laughed. So what do? I asked. You take what the bank returns through the dispute process. You let the forgery and trespass proceed through their own channels. Those are out of your hands now regardless, and you decide whether the remaining balance is worth a civil suit or whether that energy belongs somewhere else. He paused. There is no wrong answer, but there is an expensive one and a less expensive one, and only you know which one you can live with. I sat with that for a moment. Through the wall, Margaret said something sharp and short to Nina, not pain, frustration, the sound of someone pushing past a limit they were determined not to accept. Then Nina's voice, calm and steady. Again, you've got it. I made my decision without drama, without a long internal debate, without anything more complicated than listening to my wife fight for herself through a wall and knowing exactly where my energy needed to go. Let the bank process run, I said. Leave the rest. Good, Marcus said simply. What do I owe you? I'll send an invoice, he said. Don't have a heart attack when you open it. I thanked him and hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a moment, with my hands flat on the surface, and the afternoon quiet around me, Nina's counting Margaret's effort. The refrigerator humming the sound of a house that was slowly and imperfectly, and without any guarantees, becoming itself again. Then Margaret called from the living room. "Walter." Her voice had a quality to it I did not immediately recognize. "Come in here." When I stepped into the living room, Margaret was not standing at the window or reaching for something on a high shelf. She was just sitting in her wheelchair looking at the afternoon light on the floor, and when she saw me, she said, "Sit with me for a minute." That was all. No news. No announcement. Just a woman who had been alone in a house for 9 weeks and still sometimes needed someone to simply be in the same room. I sat with her until the light changed. 3 months is not a long time. It is not long enough to forget what a refrigerator looks like when it is nearly empty. Not long enough to stop noticing every time I come downstairs in the morning that the lights are on, that small, ordinary fact of a house with someone living properly in it again. Not long enough to stop feeling something in my chest loosen slightly every single morning when I hear Margaret's voice from the kitchen telling Tasha that she does not need help with that particular thing. Thank you, she can manage it herself. She had gained 9 pounds since I came home. Nina told me at the end of the 2nd month the way medical professionals deliver good news, matter-of-factly, with the careful restraint of someone who knows that hope and progress are not the same thing, and that celebrating too loudly can make the next setback feel like a failure. But her eyes were warm when she said it, and she let me have the moment before she moved on to the next item on her assessment. 9 pounds. And the color had come back to Margaret's face, not all at once, but gradually, the way color returns to anything that has been kept from light for too long. First just around her cheeks, then the rest of her. One morning I came downstairs and looked at her across the kitchen and thought, there you are, the particular thought of a person who has been looking for someone and has finally found them standing right where they always were. Tasha came 5 days a week, the same schedule we had started with in February. She and Margaret had developed the particular shorthand of 2 women who had spent a great deal of time together in a small house navigating a large difficulty. They argued cheerfully about television programs, disagreed about the correct amount of black pepper in scrambled eggs, and had apparently reached some private agreement about the optimal temperature of the downstairs bathroom that I was not privy to and had learned not to question. Nina came 3 times a week. The progress was real but uneven, the way real progress always is. There were sessions that ended with Margaret exhausted and frustrated, sessions where she pushed too hard and paid for it the next day. Sessions where Nina had to talk her back from the particular despair of feeling like she was working as hard as she possibly could and still falling short of where she wanted to be. And there were sessions where something shifted. I did not always witness those directly. More often I heard them, the quality of Margaret's voice changing through the wall or from the next room, some tightness leaving it, some new steadiness coming in. I had learned to recognize that sound, the way you learn to recognize any sound that matters enough, you stop having to think about it and start just knowing. The legal matters moved at their own pace, which is to say slowly and without drama. The bank dispute process returned a portion of the money, not everything, but enough that Marcus called it a reasonable outcome without qualifying it further, which from Marcus was something close to enthusiasm. The forgery investigation was ongoing. That was all I knew, and Marcus had advised me to know nothing more until there was something concrete to act on. Kevin had not contacted me since the afternoon he stood on my porch. I did not know if he had called Dr. Pritchard. I hoped he had. That was the honest answer, not for my sake, not even entirely for Margaret's sake, but for Sophie's, who deserved a father who was trying to be better than the version of himself that had stood on a ship's deck at 3 a.m. staring at dark water because he could not face what he had done. Helen Brooks brought a casserole over in the 2nd month, the way she had in the early days after Margaret's accident. She stayed for coffee and did not mention Kevin or the cruise or any of it. Just sat at the kitchen table and talked about her garden and a novel she was reading and the new family that had moved in 2 houses down. Normal things. The gift of treating a house that has been through something as though it is simply a house again. I accepted that gift. I accepted it the way I was trying to accept most things those days, not perfectly. Not without the occasional 3 in the morning hour of lying in the dark, cataloging everything that had gone wrong and everything that might still go wrong, but with a growing recognition that the house was still standing, the woman I loved was still in it. And both of those facts were worth more than the ones I was losing sleep over. One Saturday afternoon, I was reading in the armchair by the front window when I heard Nina's voice shift registers in the living room from the steady coaching tone she used during exercises to something quieter, more intent. Then Margaret's voice, very focused, counting under her breath. I set the book down on the armrest. Then Margaret called my name. Not loudly, not urgently. Just my name in a tone I had not heard from her in a long time, the particular tone of someone who has something to show you and wants to make sure you are paying attention. I stood up from the armchair and walked to the doorway of the living room. Margaret was standing, both hands on the frame of her walker knuckles, pale with the effort. Feet planted on the hardwood floor, chin lifted. Her whole body was trembling with the concentration it required to simply be upright without the wheelchair beneath her. She was standing. Tasha was in the corner of the room with her phone in her hand, and her hand pressed against her mouth. Nina was 2 steps away, close enough to catch, still enough not to interfere. Margaret looked at me across the room. Her eyes were bright and fierce and wet all at once, and she said in a voice that shook only slightly, "Don't you dare come over here and help me." I did not move. Every instinct I had, 60 years of reflexes built around the idea that when someone you love is struggling, you close the distance, was firing at once. Telling me to cross the room, to put my hands out, to be useful in the way I had always understood being useful to mean. My feet knew exactly what to do. They had been doing it my entire adult life. I stood in the doorway and did not move. Margaret's eyes were fixed on me with an expression I can only describe as fierce, not angry, not challenging, but the particular fierceness of someone who needs you to understand something without being told twice. Her hands gripped the walker frame so tightly that the tendons along the backs of them stood out in sharp relief, and the trembling that ran through her arms and shoulders was visible from across the room. She was going to do this. She was going to do it whether I helped or not, and she needed me to know that. Nina stood 2 steps to Margaret's left, close enough to catch, far enough not to interfere, the exact positioning of someone who had done this many times and understood the precise geometry of when presence becomes intrusion. Tasha had not moved from the corner. I could see her in my peripheral vision, phone raised, recording without making a sound. Margaret took the first step. It was small, careful. Her right foot lifted perhaps 2 inches off the hardwood and came down 6 inches forward, and the effort it required was visible in every part of her. The set of her jaw, the adjustment of her shoulders, the way her breath came out in a short, controlled exhale, like someone releasing pressure from a valve. 1. She took the second step, her left foot this time. Less careful than the first, or maybe more determined. There is a version of determination that looks like carelessness from the outside, because it has stopped spending energy on hesitation. Her left foot came down, and she was still upright and still moving, and the trembling in her arms had not stopped, but she had stopped caring about the trembling. 2. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth. The third step was stronger than the second. I do not know how, I do not know where she found it, but the third step had something in it that the first 2 did not, some quality of momentum that comes from a body remembering what it was built for. Her chin lifted slightly, her shoulders squared by a fraction. 3. On the fourth step, she began to cry. Not loudly, not the broken, exhausted crying of the first night when I had come home to a dark house and a cold wife who had been holding herself together alone for 9 weeks. This was different, quieter, and more complete. The kind of crying that happens when a body is doing 2 enormous things at once and cannot contain both of them. She cried, and she kept moving, and the fourth step landed as solidly as the third, and she was still standing still, going, the tears running freely down her face, and her hands still locked on the walker frame. 4. She took a fifth step. Then she stopped. Not because she had to. I understood that even from across the room she stopped, because she had decided to, because 5 was the number she had set for herself before she started, and she was not the kind of woman who changed her own terms in the middle of something just because she had momentum. She stopped, and she stood, and she breathed. I was crying too. I had not noticed when it started. My vision had gone blurry somewhere around the third step, and I had not done anything about it. And now there were tears on my face, and I did not particularly care. Across the room, Tasha had lowered her phone and pressed it flat against her chest, and her own face was wet, and Nina was looking at the ceiling with the careful composure of a professional who was working very hard to remain professional. Margaret looked at me. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling with the effort of it, and her face was wet, and her arms were shaking, and she was smiling a real smile. Not the careful, managed smile she had given me in the early days when she was trying not to worry me, but the wide, helpless, unguarded smile of someone who has just surprised themselves. 5, she said. Her voice came out rough and triumphant and completely undone all at once. I crossed the room. I did not run. I walked because running felt like it would disturb something in the air that I did not want disturbed. I walked across the living room floor, and I crouched down in front of her wheelchair, which Nina had positioned behind her, without my noticing, ready for when she needed it. And I took both of Margaret's hands in mine, the way I had on the first night kneeling in front of her in the dark. Her hands were warm this time. 5, I said back to her. She laughed that short, wet laugh that lives right next to tears, and sometimes gets mistaken for one, and she squeezed my hands with a strength that still surprised me even now, even after 3 months of watching her fight her way back from a place that had felt, in the worst weeks, like it might be permanent. We stayed like that for a moment. Her standing, me crouching, both of us crying, Tasha and Nina tactfully pretending to find other things to look at. Then Tasha said from across the room, "Okay, I'm putting this on the refrigerator." Margaret laughed again, properly this time, and I felt the sound of it go straight through me like something coming home. Later, after Nina had helped Margaret back into her chair after Tasha had made tea and set it on the kitchen table after the ordinary afternoon had reassembled itself around the extraordinary thing that had just happened in the living room, Margaret and I sat across from each other in the kitchen, the way we had sat across from each other 10,000 times in 36 years of mornings and evenings and ordinary meals. She wrapped her hands around her mug. They did not shake. "Ah, Walter." Her voice was quieter now, the triumph settled into something steadier. "Do you regret going to Alaska?" I looked at her across the table. The afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window, at the angle it only reaches in late summer, long and golden, making everything it touched look like it had been kept somewhere safe. I thought about the question, honestly, the way she deserved. "Yes," I said. She looked at me. "Really, I regret not seeing what was happening sooner," I said. "I regret telling myself that everything was fine because the alternative was too difficult to look at from 2,000 miles away." I paused. I regret the months of your life that I can't give back. Margaret was quiet for a moment. And the other part? She asked. The part where you went because we needed the money. I don't regret that, I said. I'd do it again. I just wouldn't do it the same way. She nodded slowly. Her thumbs moved in small circles on the side of the mug, a gesture I had watched her make for 3 decades, the particular motion she made when she was settling something inside herself. Good, she said finally. That's the right answer. Outside the kitchen window, the elm tree in the backyard moved in a late afternoon wind, its leaves catching the light, the way they had every August for as long as we had lived in this house. The bird feeder was full again. I had filled it the previous weekend, standing on the back steps in the early morning before anyone else was awake, doing one of the small, ordinary things that a house requires of the people who live in it. Margaret looked at me over the rim of her mug with those clear, tired, familiar eyes. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The bird feeder," I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she smiled, small, private, the kind that doesn't need an explanation. "Go fill it," she said. "I already did," I said. Her smile widened. "Good," she said again. "That's also the right answer. I have been a lot of things in my 60 years. A son, a husband, a father. A man who could rebuild a diesel engine in a field in the middle of a Colorado winter and have it running before the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. A man who thought for most of his adult life that being useful was the same thing as being good. It took me a long time to understand the difference. Tasha still comes 5 days a week. Nina still comes 3 times. Margaret walked 7 steps last Tuesday. 7, not 5, and did not mention it until dinner. At which point she said it, the way she says most things that matter to her, quietly, without ceremony, watching my face to see if I understood the significance before she had to explain it. I understood. I do not know if Kevin called Dr. Pritchard. I have not asked, and Kevin has not offered. What I know is that Sophie called Margaret from her own phone 2 weeks ago. Jessica had given it back to her the day they landed. Not a borrowed phone, not a number. I did not recognize her own phone, her own name on the screen, and they talked for 40 minutes. And when Margaret hung up, she sat at the kitchen table for a while without saying anything. And eventually she said, "She sounds more like herself." That was enough. That was more than enough. The forgery investigation is ongoing. I have stopped measuring my life by its outcome. I went to Alaska to save my family. I came home to find that the money I had earned was being used to abandon the woman I had earned it for. I locked a card. I changed some locks. I stood on a porch and said no to my son for the first time in 35 years. And it was the hardest thing I have ever done that was also the right thing. But none of that is what I want to tell you. What I want to tell you is this. For 60 years, I believed that a good father kept the door open, kept the checkbook ready, kept showing up to pull his son out of whatever hole his son had managed to fall into, because that was what love looked like. That was what I had been taught, and I had taught it back, and I had called it devotion when it was something more complicated than that. I understand now that I was not only loving Kevin, I was also making it possible for him to keep falling. There is a version of love that protects people from consequences. It feels like kindness. It looks like generosity. And it is, in its way, it comes from a real place, a place that genuinely cannot stand to watch someone you raised from nothing suffer the results of their own choices. But it is also, if you are not careful, a way of telling someone that they do not have to be responsible for themselves, that there is always a net, that the ground is never really as close as it looks. I drove thousands of miles worth of work in Alaska to save my family. When I came home, I found that money being used to leave the woman I loved alone in a cold house with a bag of crackers and no one to help her off the floor. I locked the card. I changed the locks. But the most important thing I changed was not in the bank or on the door. It was a rule I should have set years ago, a simple one, the kind that takes a lifetime to learn and about 30 seconds to say out loud. My love from that day forward would no longer come with a blank check. My personal opinion: love is not a blank check. It never was. I just took 60 years and one very cold refrigerator to understand that. Do not wait as long as I did. I am grateful to God and to the woman who held on through 9 weeks alone and still found the strength to take 5 steps across a living room floor that I came home when I did. These grandpa stories do not always end cleanly. This one did not. Kevin and I are still finding our way back to each other slowly without a map. But the door is not closed. It is just no longer unlocked by default. If this grandpa story stayed with you, if you have lived something like it or loved someone who has, I would be honored if you shared it, left a thought in the comments, or stayed with this channel for the family story that comes next. Your presence here means more than you know. Thank you for staying until the end. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements created for the purpose of entertainment and reflection. If this type of content is not for you, we completely respect that. Please feel free to find something that speaks to you.